class. Okay, I guess we're on. The monitor in back isn't on, so that's all right. We'll carry on here. I wanted to finish after the fire drill, which cut us about 10 minutes short on Thursday. I wanted to finish the Labyrinth of Solitude. I hope you saw the email that I sent to you on the website telling you to bring your text, but if you didn't, let me just go through really quickly a quick recap of that essay, which to me is so important. Remember, we talked about the ways in which Octavio Paz sets up a dyad, or if you want, a binary, a twosome, where one, that is the U.S., is one thing, and Mexico, that second element, or first, if you wanted to do it that way, is opposed to the others. So there are a series of oppositions: the nature of the indigenous peoples, nomadic versus settled, the difference in the imperial projects of England and Spain. Right? The Spanish were inclusive because it's a centrist system, so they needed to put everybody under the umbrella of the one true church, which was Catholicism. So this centrist system, which is inclusive, as opposed to a pluralist system, the Protestant one, which is exclusive. No need to include everybody, because if you disagree, you just go found a new religion. Or if you're an indigenous person, that's fine. You just carry on with your business and I'll carry on with mine. There were some Protestant missionaries. But if you read the early Puritan texts, you'll see that it's quite a different project from the ones we're going to be talking about in Galeano. Okay, so that the different imperial projects, that difference between the state and the nation. Mexico was a state before it was a nation, according to Paz, whereas vice versa, in the U.S., it was a nation before it was a state. You'll remember those, and you'll pay attention to them as you start to read Galeano and see how some of these generalizations and differences in culture operate. What I wanted to do was look at the last couple paragraphs of Paz, because remember that essay is published in 1979 in the New Yorker in English for an American audience. This very strong voice of a very strong Mexican writer warning the U.S. to watch out, that we've forgotten the other, or others that were so involved. So it becomes a very polemical piece, and I just thought we would look at that at the end, and we can agree or disagree, depending on our opinions as to how the U.S. operates in the world, but I may not be able to resist giving you one of my opinions. But let's look at Paz's first. It's page 375 in the version that you have on the website. And I think we could even go to 376. Well, the paragraph starts the very last line of 375. So let's look at the final paragraph. And if you don't mind, I'll read it, because I see some of you don't have your text, which is fine. The fire drill kind of threw us off here a minute. But let's just look at this. I think it's worth thinking about the critique that the Mexican writer is making of the northern neighbor, especially in the light of almost 30 years more of, let's say, conflictual, if not disastrous, history of national relations, especially with the immigration question. I mean, we can talk about whether NAFTA has advanced U.S.-Mexico relations, whether it's helped Mexico, whether it's helped the U.S., but what we can be sure of is the U.S. lacks an immigration policy, which is why twice the Congress in the spring rather, tried to get an immigration bill together and simply couldn't do it. I mean, when we have a Congress that cannot write legislation because nobody can agree, we know we have a problem. So this is what Octavio Paz says about the U.S. It's name-calling, if you want. Whether he's right or not is up to us to decide. It would be presumptuous of me to propose solutions to this double contradiction. The double contradiction is outlined in the paragraph just above the one we're reading. The U.S. is a republic and an empire. How can you be a republic that is a democratic country and also be an empire, taking over other countries, using them? He says that's a contradiction. There's that contradiction between freedom and equality that he talks about. I leave it to you to pay attention to that. Let's just go ahead and see what he says about U.S. society. Top of 376. I think that every time a society finds itself in crisis, it instinctively turns its eyes towards its origin and looks there for a sign. Looks backward. Well, I hope he's right about that. He's saying colonial American, he means U.S. here. Colonial U.S. society was free, egalitarian, but exclusive. We've seen him argue that point. We've given it to him. A pluralistic society doesn't have to be inclusive. We can be diverse without trying to say, look, we've all got to agree. We can differ. Okay, colonial American U.S. society was free, egalitarian, but exclusive society. Faithful to its origins and its domestic and foreign policies alike, the United States has always ignored the others. Wham. He doesn't waste words. He gets right to it. Today, the United States faces very powerful enemies, but the mortal danger comes from within, not from Moscow. This was, of course, 10 years before the fall of the wall, before the fall of the Soviet Union, let's say. Not from Moscow, but from that mixture of arrogance and opportunism, blindness and short-term Machiavellianism, volubility and stubbornness, which has characterized its foreign policies during recent years, and which reminds us in an odd way of the Athenian state in its quarrel with Sparta. To conquer its enemies, the United States must first conquer itself, return to its origins, not to repeat them, but to rectify them. The others, the minorities inside as well as the marginal countries and nations outside, do exist. Not only do we others, make up the majority of the human race, but also each marginal society, poor though it may be, represents a unique and precious version of mankind. If the United States is to recover fortitude and lucidity, it must recover itself. And to recover itself, it must recover the others, the outcasts of the Western world. So it's a very polemical ending, very much a call to American readers of The New Yorker and, of course, future readers such as ourselves to pay attention. Anybody have a reaction to that final? Remember, this is 1979. Does that have anything to do with this call to attention? Do you think he's dead wrong? I mean, what's happened since then? Are we any better than we were then, or was he wrong then? Anybody have an opinion about that? Did you mind being called bad names there at the end? Anybody have a reaction? Yeah. Julie, right? Yeah. Can you speak up?
Yes, I agree with a lot of what he says and a lot of his criticism, and I think that from 1979 to the present, it's kind of the actions of the U.S. have kind of proved his point.
For example?
The conflict between democracy and imperialism, this internal conflict that we have, that...
Can you all hear Julie back there? Okay, good. Yeah.
That democracy and self-rule and freedom and liberty should it be just for us, or should it be for everyone in the whole world?
And you think the U.S. is interested in the rest of the world in having, I mean, do you think our policies really are what POS would have them be at this point? To take care of, to recover the others, the outcasts of the Western world? Maybe that's too big an aim. Maybe no country can do that. Who knows?
Well, I don't think any country could do that, and to do that, there would have to just be a huge world war, I think, to turn every country democratic. But
aren't we trying to do that right now in Iraq? Aren't we trying to impose a system in Iraq that we feel as a country? Apparently, we voted for this war. Now, it's a big debate as to who did and who didn't. We're watching that play out. But the idea was to give to the world the great ideas that have been engendered in the U.S., really, if you want, the notion of democracy and so forth. that's a perfect example. I guess I'm just wanting you to go to a very specific example of a kind of tear. We're torn between wishing the best for everyone, which we conceive to be our own system of democracy. In many ways, it's an admirable system, and yet at the same time, we're an empire. We aren't completely disinterested when we impose democracy on Iraq. It is, after all, an oil-producing country. I mean, you can argue either side, and I don't necessarily mean to, but thank you. I think you're right, that internal strife. What about the recognition of the internal others? Yeah.
I just had one more thing to say,
yeah.
that as a capitalist nation,
yeah.
I don't think that exporting democracy and democratic values is the first role of the United States government, and I'm not saying it should be, but yeah. I think there's very conflicting, I guess there were conflicting reasons for going to war in Iraq, and that's the first example that came to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's kind of a big one at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I know it's a touchy subject.
No, it's a touchy subject, and it's very hard to ignore as we read it every single day in the papers and see it every night on TV. Yeah, so keep on going, sorry.
But I think also we've kind of been desensitized to it because it's not a war that's taking place here, and at the beginning we were only listing the U.S. casualties mm-hmm. and not the Iraqi casualties, yeah. and the issue of trying to implement a system that we ourselves have not perfected.
Yeah, and so therefore, let me pull this out of you. What you're saying would say that Paas got it right in 1979, it sounds like to me.
I think he had a lot of validity
yeah.
in his criticisms, and yeah. I don't yeah. think that in order to criticize something, you need to propose a solution, because by criticizing or being skeptical of something mm-hmm. or calling something or someone out brings it to the table, and yeah. I'm impressed that this was published, because
yeah, that's a good point.
It's so
yeah.
anti-patriotic or
yeah.
anti-American.
Anti-American, it's very anti-American.
And no one likes to hear
yeah.
bad things about themselves. So
yeah. Well, the New Yorker has always been a liberal magazine, and it's very critical. I don't know how many of you read the New Yorker. It's a wonderful magazine to read, but I guess we can. But you're right that in 1979 it wasn't, I think, so clear that we were running roughshod over the others of the Western world, though it would have been clear to a Mexican long before it might have been clear to me, say. What about the issue of multiculturalism within the U.S.? Does anybody want to address that? I mean, have we progressed in that department, would you say? 79, remember the Civil Rights Movement, 62, 63, 64. Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1969, I believe. He's writing 10 years after the Civil Rights Movement. Segregation has been ruled illegal. Well, that was in the 50s, 1954, Brown v. Education, Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. Would he have been aware of the status of Mexican immigrants in the U.S. in 1979? Yes, of course he would have been. And the first essay in the original 1950s collection of The Labyrinth of Solitude is about the Pachuco and other extremes, as Chicanos were then called, or Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. It's not a very insightful essay in my view, but it's very dated. He wonders who these Mexicans are. But by 1979, he's noticing rather bad treatment of immigrants. Anybody want to address that issue? Yes, please. Would you tell me your name again?
Melissa.
Melissa.
I read the essay, the Pachuco on the
yeah.
Labyrinth of Solitude, and
yeah.
also some of the other essays that are there. And I think that he has maybe a cohesive point throughout his essays. They all kind of sound not the same, but with the same theme. And I think that what he's trying to say is he goes back to the same thing with the inclusive and exclusive. In the United States, you can still point out a culture and say this is a Chinese culture, this is a Mexican culture, and they still hold back their traditions, sometimes their language, their customs. And in Mexico, even though there is a variety of races living together, hardly any of them speaks anything else than Spanish, even though we know that they're probably not all Spanish descent.
Yeah, 10% actually of Mexicans speak an indigenous language according to the 2000 census. They counted 30 indigenous languages, of which 10% of the entire population speak them, but yeah, they're very different. It's the mestizo idea, the mixing of cultures in Mexico, as opposed to our melting pot idea. You come here and then one generation you forget your language too. But your point would be that he's contrasting this way of dealing with the internal differences. They're very different ways. Mestizaje, meaning the mixture of cultures, which is an inclusive thing, isn't it? The Catholics had no problem with intermarriage. Why? Because they're all God's children. So you can say intermarriage, you can say rape if you want, which happened, of course, enormously. Indian women were, and La Malinche, the first example, the first almost mythic but historical figure, Cortes's mistress, who had a baby called Martin by La Malinche, and of course that became a matter for celebration after the Mexican Revolution. La raza cósmica, I don't know if you've read Vasconcelos. He says, the Mexican race, it's the mixture of European and indigenous. There's still plenty of separation of races, but so within the U.S., is your opinion, do you have an opinion, that since 1979 we've done better? Without thinking about Mexico for the moment, we've done better in terms of our multiculturalism, in terms of, let's say, gender fairness. That's another otherness issue. Do you have an opinion on that, Melissa?
I think that on the surface, it looks like we have done better. But when issues like, dramatic issues like Katrina come about, you can see that the racial differences are still very drastic and very much rooted deep into the U.S. culture, no matter how much we say that we are an egalitarian society.
Yeah, race and class, of course, which is very tied to race in the case of the instance you're mentioning. And of course the immigration issue that that we can't come to a consensus as a nation on how we want to deal with what we need, which is cheap labor, and yet what we don't want, because those people are breaking the law when they come into our country, it shows that we still have a lot of things to work out. So I guess what I'm wanting to suggest is that, give my own opinion, which I've been doing anyway, but both Julie and Melissa are suggesting, I think, the kinds of issues that I want to point to too, and that is to say that Paz isn't so far off in 1979. In fact, I think he's rather prophetic in some ways, because we weren't perhaps used. I was part of the student revolution. I was in Berkeley in the late 60s and early 70s, and we marched against the war in Vietnam, and that there was really a protest movement, which led to the feminist movement. I think the most profound revolution in my lifetime has been that I can be standing up here in front of you. I went to college in the 70s, and I went to graduate school, 60s, and then graduate school in the 70s. And I counted up later. It was so invisible to me. It's like what we were talking about, what culture is. You can't see your own because it's all natural. It took me years to figure out I should count up how many women professors I'd had in the course of my graduate and undergraduate education, and I came up with 2. And that's how many there were. Now, of course, so professions opened up to women. There are plenty of women doctors. So gender-wise, I think we've done better with respect to otherness in the culture, because women were other, really. We did get the vote in anybody know the date exactly of the amendment to the Constitution? Where are our historians? What? 1990. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we've had the vote since 1919, but we didn't get to do a lot of professional work until the 60s and 70s. We weren't encouraged to. There were exceptions to that. Yeah, Julie.
And I think there's always a marked difference, temporal difference between when the laws are changed and when people's minds and opinions change. Yeah. Because sexism, there are a lot of government programs that try to rid the workplace of sexism, but there are still a lot of stereotypes in popular culture about women and gender roles and
sure, and race and ethnicity and so forth. So you're right that changing the law is one thing, and that can change behaviors in a hurry. I mean, segregation was enforced, but it didn't mean that people started to be less racist. I think we've made some. Look at U of H. I'm always so proud when I walk around U of H. I've been here for almost 30 years, and U of H looks very different from what it did. And I'm so proud to be a part of a school where really we have a lot of first-generation college students. That is, students who are the first generation in their family to go to college, and oftentimes that's a question of ethnicity and race, and it's a question sometimes of gender, less so. So I think we have made some progress, but I think both of you are correct in suggesting that there's still a long way to go, and that's what Octavio Paz wants us to think about. So he's the outsider telling us to look to the outside. And I think that's an important message. So I hope we've gotten some of the historical structure that he wants us to think about difference, because you can't think about the other without thinking about how you are different from the other. You have to be a comparatist. So that's what we're going to start thinking about in this class, how others differ from us, what we might do about that, or what my idea is you learn about the other. I'm an educator. I travel, I go study the other. I know about Mexico. I've spent years learning about Mexico and other parts of Latin America. And I said, well, does that do any good? Well, I hope that something like knowledge is something like power and something like generosity furthermore. So anyway, we'll all keep this question in front of us as we go along. Other comments about Octavio Paz? I'm glad to hear, Melissa, that you've read other parts of this book. Did you read that just now, or have you read Octavio Paz? Yeah.
Version in Spanish.
Yeah, it's kind of a classic by now, isn't it? And the Pachuco and Other Extremes is really, I think, a very dated essay. As you know, Latinos don't like that essay very much because he's trying as a mainstream Mexican to figure out this odd branch of Mexicanidad in Los Angeles. But okay. So I'm going to consider that this is under your belt, and we're going to move to Galeano. Now I'm going to go and just indicate on your website, if you'll notice, there is on, let's see, do we have that up there? Yes. The fall web projects for 2005, one of my great students, Megan Thuman, who then became actually an assistant to me in an online course, did her website on Galeano. I encourage you to go there. There are others also. Just shop through both of those years, 2004, 2005, web papers, because you need to be thinking about your own topic. But Megan's was particularly interesting. We're not going to do it all together, but if you go to here's Galeano, age 67, born in Montevideo, Uruguay, in 1940, and she's given a nice picture, but what she's wanted to do in this, it's rather an ambitious website, is she's wanted to give an overview of the trilogy, and that's what she does. So go and just see what she has to say. What she decides to do, and see, you learn all these links and all of this, but it's very creative, I think, because she takes a text from the first book, and she tells us where it is. It's page 3. It's the Aztec, or Maya rather, myth of how the world is born, the creation myth. We're going to see several of them. And then she describes her sense of this first volume. I want you to just take a look at her version. You know, it's kind of interesting. And what she's done, and you'll be encouraged to do that, I think it's one of the requirements, is John Winthrop is mentioned, and then here she gives us a link, and you can do this, you'll learn how to do a link to John Winthrop, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, and you're going to be required to do this so I can get back home easily as a viewer, and then I can go back to the trilogy, and she does the same thing. I won't go through them with both of the other volumes. So it's a nice overview for you. And then if we go here to, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I wanted to go back, just show you one more aspect of her web paper. she decides to focus on indigenous peoples. And what she does is she takes, because Galeano is interested in all of the Americas, not just Latin America, she takes 3 groups and she's looking at them, and she shows how Galeano treats them. She just gives text, as I recall. No, she actually has done research on the Mayas, and then I think she gives, no, she really went out of her way, I must say. Don't get too panicked. It doesn't. Back to civilizations. The Haida are in northern British Columbia, Canada, because you'll see that one of Galeano's great concerns is the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and they're very alive and well. He also shows how terribly they were treated and so forth. So it's a very prominent theme in all of the 3 Galeanos, but of course the first 2 more than others. And she looks at this group who are from the south of South America. So it's a kind of interesting take on Galeano. I also encourage you, whenever we're reading a novel, which is all the time, or a particular writer, go to Wikipedia. Just Google in the name of, say, Eduardo Galeano and see what comes up, just to give yourself as much context for the reading. I mean, I do the same. I go and see, okay, what's he got in English lately? In fact, I just did that on Wikipedia this morning. And I want to give you a little introduction to his other work. But I thought I'd point out that particular website. And then what I want to do is point out the maps on our website. As you read these entries, each one has a place name as well as a date. Galeano is a great chance to get an overview of a huge amount of cultural and political and social history, and to locate it in time and place, because it gives you the date and the place. So when you see a little title at the beginning of the chapters, which are of the mosaic pieces, which they all have, except for the mythic entries at the beginning, then please, would you go to the maps or go to Google again? I've put these in a certain order, these maps, but I want you to know where stuff is, and on the final exam there's going to be a map, and you're going to have to fill in some stuff. I'm sorry, it sounds like 3rd grade, but I think so much, it's my own thing. I never got a course in geography. I struggle to remember where this is relative to that. If I'd only learned it better. I only learned the geography of the state of Iowa. I can tell you all the rivers in the state of Iowa because that's where I was when I was in 7th grade. But anyway, I hope that by the end of this course you'll have a real sense of the important dates that we're going to keep on repeating and repeating, and that I've given you a sheet on already, and that you have a sense of space. So there's a South American map, there's the map of Spain, I put those first, North American, and then I'd like to show you these historical maps. This is going to be useful for your sense of reading Galeano, how America was colonized. Now, this is a very nice map that shows you now North and South America in the 18th century. The pink bits are Spain. The green or gray bits are Portuguese. And this is you know, up here, of course, we've got England going. Up here, we've got France going. So this North American, there's some Holland, Dutch, of course. But what this map is interested in is the Hispanic holdings. So we have, or let's say Iberian, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, right? So Brazil is, of course, Portuguese. What we have is the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which extends down to about, let's see, about here. There's the line. All of this is New Spain, including Santa Fe, including San Antonio, including Houston, which doesn't yet exist, up to San Francisco, and indeed further north yet. So it's a huge holding, right? And then we have the second viceroyalty. What does the viceroyalty mean? It means there was a viceroy that was sent, chosen by the king to rule over a huge amount of territory. New Spain, New Granada, Peru, the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. So there were essential, and then this Viceroyalty of Peru actually is in 2 pieces. They had to give Pacific access to the Rio de la Plata. Much later, the dates are much later, and I will see those. I think it's 1777. I'm not quite sure about that. When the fourth viceroyalty is established. But it's the way that Spain ruled its colonies. In Brazil, there was a royalty established. We'll learn about that. It was another form of colonial administration. But I just wanted to point out that map. Now I'm going to go back and show you the next one. I want you to keep these maps open on your computer as you're reading Galeano, so you'll see where stuff is as it's going on. The Viceroyalty of Peru is a little closer up. It's divided into different parts. What is now Colombia and much of, I'm sorry, this is New Granada. Let's go down to the key. Hang on. The Viceroyalty, 1717, it's not 1777, sorry, way off. 1717, the Viceroyalty of New Granada. Then another one, Peru, 1776, not too far off, 1 year, and Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, 1776. So the colonizing structure of viceroyalties moves from New Spain to New Granada to Peru and to the fourth, which is the Rio de la Plata. Here's the Rio de la Plata, right? So pay attention to this so you can figure out what's going on. And then one more. Spanish and Portuguese trade routes. It wasn't enough for Spain and Portugal to just rule those huge hunks of the Americas, which I've just shown you. It was also that they had huge trading routes to the Far East, over the Pacific, and that here is what you see. The Philippines are conquered for Spain in something like 1556. So that's about the moment where, as I said to you, under Charles V, the Habsburg king, the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire because the Far East had been, quote, conquered. The Philippines, the Moluccas, Macau, on the shore, the coast of China and so forth. Back and forth, and Mexico was the place where it all went through. So you go to Mexico right now and you'll see Mexican Talavera porcelain, and there's going to be lots of Chinese motifs, and you're going to say, why would that be? This stuff was carried across Mexico, put down. The Panama Canal was only built at the beginning of the 20th century, and going around the bottom of the Cape was not a great idea. So Mexico was an incredible transcultural place. Lots of stuff coming back and forth. And so we have China, the fabrics and so forth. New Spain, now Mexico City, or well, the capital of Mexico City, of New Spain, which is Mexico City, was one of the biggest and wealthiest countries of the world because of this incredible trade between the Americas, the Far East, and Europe. So pay attention to this map and notice here stuff is taken off the boats in Acapulco. It's carried and put on at Veracruz. So there's a great deal of trade, let's say, going on. But you can see how Spain had the world covered here. Look at San Francisco, looks pretty far north when we look at it like this. This whole coast belongs. So the Pacific trade was immense, as was the exploitation of minerals and so forth, in minerals and human souls, human bodies in Spanish America. We're going to be concerned with Brazil a bit, but I know less about Brazil than I know about Spanish America. Lusitanian America. Which is to say Portuguese America, I know less about, but we're going to follow it in memory of fire. So pay attention, the maps will be on the final, and I'm also going to tell you how I handle Galeano on the final so that you'll know how to read. I take it you're just going through, and it might, how are you doing on the reading? Are you enjoying it? Is it interesting? It's kind of like popping peanuts, as I said. You just get going on one and they say, wait a minute, what I do is I cheat. I go to the index and I look for ones that have several entries, like Charles V, for example. We're going to look at that. He has 6 entries. Or Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, she has 6 or 7. And then I skip. Somehow I like a story not to be interrupted all the time. On the other hand, I also open any place. So I want to tell you how I'm going to handle it on the final. I want you to read all 3 books. I want you to pay attention when there's a reference, as there always is, with that number at the bottom of the entry. I would call it a mosaic, this a piece, this set, this vignette. I don't know what you want to call each of these small textual pieces. I always go like this when I'm talking about them. Do pay attention, and especially the ones you're interested in. Lots of times I'll turn and say, I wonder what reference this is. And sometimes it's in English, sometimes it's French, sometimes it's... I notice he cites Lévi-Strauss in French, the great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, Le cru et le cuit, the raw and the cooked is how it's translated. So sometimes if you're really interested, Google the author, and maybe the book will be in English as well as in Spanish. But what I do, I'm going to read to you from the review sheet for which I will give you for your final. I give out a review sheet. And what I ask you to do, I'll read it in a minute, what I ask you to do is between the last class and when you come in for the final is to prepare Galeano. I don't ask you to know all of Galeano for the final. I ask you to prepare themes. I ask you to choose 3 passages from each of the 3 texts, and I ask you then to tell me about them. What is the thread that runs through them? Here's what I ask you to do. This is a take-home before the final, but it saves you from killing yourselves knowing all of Galeano, as much as I want you to read him all. Describe a distinctive thematic thread running through each of the 3 volumes of Eduardo Galeano's Memory of Fire. You may describe a different thread for each of the 3 volumes, or find a single thread that winds through all 3. Please give 3 examples for each of the 3 volumes, 9 examples altogether, and show how they are interconnected. What is Galeano's attitude toward the material in the passages that you have chosen? How do you know? Do not neglect to discuss the narrative style and structure of the examples you've chosen. In other words, treat it like literature as well as a way of saying something, say, about violence to indigenous peoples, something about political corruption. I mean, you find, I can go on, something about, there are a lot of negative threads in Galeano because the history of the Americas has been a violent one. Extermination of peoples, damaging, but there's also a great deal of positive. It depends on, there are witches everywhere, and there are practices that are considered to be scary. Dancing is one. We'll look at it in a minute. So anyway, you have to have this prepared in your head. Then you come into the class and you spend, what, a half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever I give to it in terms of time on the finals. So think in terms of thematic clusters as you're reading. I think you'll find that a good way to keep a little bit of order in what is an immense amount of territory that's covered in the 3 volumes. Does that sound okay? I just thought I'd give you a heads up because Galeano is not your usual writer. You won't use the books in the exam. You'll have this in your head. You'll have thought it through. It's not so hard to remember 9. I mean, imagine if you were actually being tested on the whole thing. You'd have to remember a lot more than that. So, but I want you to think thematically and think polemically if you want. This is a hugely polemical work. Galeano's furious about a lot of stuff. We thought Paz was scolding us. It won't feel like anything. And he scolds a lot more than the U.S. There's been a tremendous amount of injustice, a tremendous amount of suffering, and so we're going to see that. But first what I want to do is look at the introduction. He tells us what he's going to do, and then I want to look at his idea of history. Remember, that's the subtext of this course. What is history? What does a given writer think about history, and how does he define history itself? How does he define the past? How do we know the past? How do we tell the past? All of those questions that are as much for literature students as for historians. So go to the preface, will you? It's page XV. Does anybody have the 3-in-1? Each of you have 3 different volumes. Yeah, okay. It's easy anyway, so go to the preface. It happens to be in my volume, which I think I see some of you have a newer cover anyway. Is yours XV, the page 15? Yeah. Alrighty, thank you. He starts out, I was a wretched history student. Don't you love it? History classes were like visits to the waxworks or the region of the dead. The past was lifeless, hollow, dumb. By dumb he means mute, right? They taught us about the past so that we should resign ourselves with drained consciences to the present, not to make history which was already made, but to accept it. Poor history had stopped breathing. Notice the personification he gives to history, a life, a body. It had stopped. It was dead. Betrayed in academic texts, lied about in classrooms, drowned in dates, they had imprisoned her in museums and buried her with floral wreaths beneath statuary, bronze, and monumental marble. Perhaps Memory of Fire can give back her breath, liberty, and the word. Now that's hubristic, isn't it? I'm going to resuscitate history for you readers. Well, he's giving us a different way to think about and a different structure to enter into history. So that's his big aim, not anything modest. We'll just keep going. Through the centuries, Latin America has been despoiled of gold and silver, nitrates and rubber, copper and oil. Its memory has also been usurped. From the outset, it has been condemned to amnesia by those who have prevented it from being. Official Latin American history boils down to a military parade of bigwigs in uniforms fresh from the dry cleaners. I am not a historian. I am a writer who would like to contribute to the rescue of the kidnapped memory of all America, but above all of Latin America, that despised and beloved land. I would like to talk to her, share her secrets, ask her of what difficult clays she was born from, what acts of love and violation she comes. I don't know to what literary form this voice of voices belongs. Voice of voices. He's going to let us hear a lot of voices. This is the question of genre, G-E-N-R-E. Literature students will know perfectly well what that means. A sonnet is a particular, well, there's poetry, there's drama, there's the novel. Those are genres. It means type or kind. And we're used to, this is a new genre. It's just simply, it's not like most histories. It's not a novel. You can't say it's short fiction. So he raises right away the question of his weird literary form. Memory of Fire is not an anthology, clearly not. But I don't know if it is a novel or essay or epic poem or testament or chronicle or deciding robs me of no sleep. I don't believe in the frontiers that, according to literature's customs officers separate forms. He says, I'm going to do it all the way I want to do it, and I'm not going to pay attention to distinctions that are usually made between and among genres. I don't want to write an objective book, neither wanted to nor could. There is nothing neutral about this historical narration. You see, he's taking off all the veils. I don't care about the form. I'm going to do it my way. And I'm not going to pull any punches. There's a lot of opinion here, he's going to say. There's nothing neutral about this historical narration. Unable to distance myself, I take sides. I confess it, and am not sorry. However, each fragment of this huge mosaic, that's what I love. I do love the notion of fitting the little pieces. We could say puzzle, too. Fitting the pieces together and getting a design at the end, a form, an image. This huge mosaic is based on a solid documentary foundation. What is told here has happened, although I tell it in my style and manner. This book, he even plays here in the preface, this book is the first of a trilogy. It's divided into two parts. In one, indigenous creation myths raise the curtain on pre-Columbian America. In the other, and that's about 30, 40 pages, and then the rest is post-Columbian, meaning after 1492. We'll see the first dated entry is 1492. Raise the curtain on pre-Columbian, in other words, the history of America unfolds from the end of the 15th century to the year 1700. So here we are, 1492 to 1700. This is the first, it's terribly chronological. We're going to jump here, we're going to jump there, we're not going to do it all in a line, but we have a block of time that's covered here. prehistory, pre-Columbia. I shouldn't say prehistory, that's really unfair. Indigenous groups certainly have had histories and modes of recording history, but let's say pre-Columbian, pre-1492, pre-contact of cultures, contact of European and American cultures. The second volume, which we will see next week, is in Memory of Fire, will cover 18th and 19th centuries. That's Faces and Masks. The third volume will reach up to our own time. Ends at 1984, an auspicious date. The numbers in parentheses at the foot of each text indicate the principal works consulted by the author in search of information and reference points. The documentary sources are listed at the end. We've already said that. The heading of each historical episode shows the year and the place of its occurrence. Literal transcriptions appear in italics. That's important. The author has modernized the spelling of the ancient sources cited. Not in every piece of the mosaic, but in many, you'll find an italicized sentence or two. He's quoting directly from the source that you will find at the bottom of that entry. In other words, he's being a serious scholar and a serious historian, showing what's his words and what are somebody else's words. And he uses them very, very wisely, these interpolated comments. Okay, so we have his stated intent. We don't have to wonder. We wondered about Octavio Paz's a bit. We didn't talk about it as much as I would have liked. But now we've got the statement. Now let's go. I'm going to show you. Occasionally he's going to give us a little mirror of the book within the book. Sometimes that happens in books, that you'll see a little sort of, in a nutshell, what the whole book is about. I think I found one of those nutshells on page 77. Would you go there, please? It's the one called, see if our pagination continues coherent, I hope so. It's the one called "The Poet Will Tell Children the Story of This Battle." Do you have that on page 77? Yeah, it's 1524 Quetzaltenango, which I happen to. Well, let's just read it first. We're going to do a lot of reading out loud here. They're so short, and what's the point of paraphrasing? But what I want to suggest is that there are others, but this one I choose because I love it. It shows how Galeano conceives of history. He's told us in the preface that history's dead, it's been mutilated. Latin Americans and Americans generally, we have amnesia that's induced by whatever our governments or whatever. By ourselves, we prefer not to think about indigenous peoples in the U.S., for example. I don't know, name an example. He's given us his declaration. He wants to resuscitate all that, but how? That's an intention, but we still don't know quite how he's going to go about it. Here he tells us, and he uses indigenous peoples to tell us, and indigenous peoples under the terrible thumb of a terrible fellow named Pedro de Alvarado, who certainly exists. He was a lieutenant of Cortes's. Cortes says, go to Guatemala, go south and keep on conquering. So he goes to Guatemala, and he's horrible to indigenous peoples. He's known as one of the most cruel of the conquistadores. So look at what we have here about Pedro de Alvarado. The poet will speak of Pedro de Alvarado and of those who came with him to teach fear. He, the poet, he's thinking of how narratives are passed on in cultures like this one. The poet will relate, telling story after story, he will relate that when the native troops had been destroyed and when Guatemala was a slaughterhouse, Captain Tecum Uman rose into the air and flew with wings and feathers sprouted from his body. He flew and fell on Alvarado and with one fierce blow severed the head of his horse. But Alvarado and the horse divided into two and stayed that way. The conquistador detached himself from the decapitated horse and stood up. Captain Tecum flew off again and rose higher, all aglow. When he dived down from the clouds, Alvarado dodged and ran him through with his lance. The dogs dashed to tear Tecumumán apart, and Alvarado's sword held them back. For a long time, Alvarado contemplated his beaten enemy, his body slashed open. The quetzal, the big, beautiful turquoise feathers of the quetzal bird. The quetzal feathers sprouted from his arms and legs, and wings broken, the triple crown of pearls, diamonds, and emeralds. Alvarado called to his soldiers. Look, he said to them, and he made them remove their helmets. The children, okay, so we see this scene. It's a scene from the indigenous poet's point of view. It's a scene of what I would call magic. But no, it's real. Let's keep going. The children, back to the narrative situation, the children seated in a circle around the poet will ask, and all this you saw, you heard? Yes. You were here, the children will ask? No. None of our people who were here survived. The poet will point to the moving clouds and the sway of the treetops. See the lances, he'll say. See the horses' hooves. The rain of arrows, the smoke. Listen, he will say, and put his ear against the ground filled with explosions. He's hearing this distant battle. And he will teach them to smell history in the wind, to touch it in stones polished by the river, and to recognize its taste by chewing certain herbs without hurry as one chews on sadness. It's very beautifully written, I think, and it's very sad. Here's the poet telling of the defeat of his people, but with the glories of this Captain Tecumumán. It's not all blood and guts. But then the children say, but how do you know? He says, I hear it in the wind. I know. So I think this last paragraph, and he will teach them to smell history in the wind. After all, the Century of Wind is one of the titles of our trilogy. To touch it in stones polished by the river, and to recognize its taste by chewing certain herbs without hurry as one chews on sadness. So we're going to feel history. We're going to imagine it. We're going to do as this. You can always tell when Galeano is celebrating something. There's absolutely no, there's the irony here that nobody survived the battle and yet we're hearing it on the wind. That's a certain sort of irony, but it's not a bitterness. Lots of times there will be a kind of bitterness. Here you see it's a celebration, a metaphor for the kind of history that he believes in, not the kind that he said, I hated history when I was a student kind. Look also, will you, at another, let's say, nutshell within the book, and that is page 155, where again, whenever the subject of history comes up and you've read your preface and he says, I'm going to write a new kind of history, then pay attention, because he's giving you examples of how that might be done. Some of them are negative examples. A lot of them are negative examples. We're going to get, when our third volume, we'll get to 1928 in Aracataca, Colombia, with the Banana Company massacre that some of you have read about in Garcia Marquez. It really happened. He's going to say, this is the kind of history, the official history that lies, that will not do. So there's plenty of negative, but I'm going for the positive examples here at the moment. 155, hang on. Sahagún, Tlatelolco, 1583. If you don't know where Tlatelolco is, and you don't know by the time you finish the piece, Google it. It happens to be a village outside of what was Tenochtitlan. It's now part of Mexico City, in fact, in the downtown of Mexico City. Sahagún, we're going to find out, is a Franciscan who came and wrote down the ways of the indigenous peoples. It took him 20 years to get permission from the head Franciscan, whoever he was applying to actually get native informants who still remembered the time before the conquest, who could say the Aztec did it this way. If you go to our library, there's the 4-volume Florentine Codex. That's the text that resulted from years and years of his gathering information after he was given permission to do so. It's a beautiful facsimile, because what Sahagún did, Bernardino de Sahagún, he's one of the great heroes of Mexican history and of American history, because he, like some friars and priests, cared about indigenous cultures instead of cared only to destroy them. Anyway, the Florentine Codex is the great text. He also wrote it up in Spanish. So you can get Sahagún's text on indigenous cultures in New Spain in language. But what he did in the 4 volumes is he used the language of the Aztecs, which was pictographic. So there are lots of illustrations of a wedding ceremony, of how an Aztec woman would grind corn, lots of images. I guess I better bring that in one of these days. Anybody want to do a great web paper on the Florentine Codex? Hey, that would be fabulous. It would give you a chance. The narrative text is called The General History of New Spain. It's going to be mentioned in a minute. But let's see, I'm still on the history topic. We're going to see that Sahagún, for Galeano, is an exemplary historian. Why? Because he cares about the other. He learns. He asks questions, he records in a way that isn't polemical and isn't destructive. Let's look at it. Lonely me, sings the ringdove. The woman offers flowers to a stone that has been smashed to pieces. Lord, says the woman to the stone, Lord, how you have suffered. She says to the stone, Lord. Right? Okay. The old native wise men offer their testimony to Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. Let us die, they plead, since our gods have died. You see, the business of the stone suggests the animism of indigenous cultures throughout the Americas. The trees, the eagle, the wind, all of it was animate. It's not like the Western modern perspective where man can develop nature, can use nature's resources. It's a bit the opposite way of thinking about it. Indigenous peoples were at the service of nature. So this woman is suffering because the stone has died. And then he makes that a kind of little metaphor for the destruction of the ancient gods by the colonizing Europeans. Fray Bernardino de Riviera, native of Sahagún. That's a place in Spain, right? Son of Francis, meaning a Franciscan, bare feet, patched cassock, seeker of the plenitude of paradise, seeker of the memory of these vanquished people. You see, now that's, for him, you can be, for Galeano, there's no greater heroism than to seek the memory, to honor memory, to honor the past of these vanquished peoples. For more than 40 years, Sahagún has been traveling through Mexico, the seigneury of Huejotzingo, outside of Cholula, you'll find it, Puebla, in the Altiplano of Mexico. The Franciscans were brought in 1524 to start Christianizing. Sahagún comes in slightly later, a few years later. It's not among the first 12 who come in 1524. Huejotzingo, Tula of the Toltecs, the Texcoco region, to rescue the images and words of times past, to rescue. In the 12 books of the General History of New Spain, Sahagún and his young assistants have saved and assembled ancient voices, the fiestas of the Indians, their rites, their gods, their ways of counting the passage of years and stars, their myths, their poems, their medicines, their tales of remote ages and of recent European invasion. History sings in this first great work of American anthropology. History sings. Wow. 6 years ago, that would be 1577. We know that because we know the date of the entry. I just subtracted 6. 1577, King Philip II, now that's the second Habsburg, the son of Charles V. You're going to know your Habsburgs, I hope. The great kings of Spain, and especially during the 16th century, the 1500s, Charles V and Philip II. 6 years ago, Philip II had those manuscripts and all the native codices copied and translated by Sahagún seized. So, and look at here's the italics. So that no original or translation of them should remain. Philip II was super Catholic. He thought that maybe the Franciscans gave Sahagún the right to do this, but he wasn't in favor of it. So he seizes them. Where they have ended up, those books suspected of perpetuating and publicizing idolatries, no one knows. It's not quite true. We have them. The Council of the Indies has not replied to any, no one knows at the time. The Council of Indies has not replied to any of the despairing author copiers' pleas. The Council of Indies, the Indies, meaning the Americas, were run out of Seville. If you go to Seville to this day, there's a huge building there where the archives of the Indies are kept. So when the Council of Indies, meaning the center of imperial authority, will not answer Sahagún's pleas. What has the king done with these 40 years of Sahagún's life and so many centuries of the life of Mexico? They say in Madrid that the pages have been used as spice wrappings. Old Sahagún does not give up. At 80, he clutches to his breast a few papers saved from the disaster and dictates to his pupils in Tlatelolco the first lines of a new work to be called Divinatory Art. Later he will go to work on a complete Mexican calendar. When he finishes the calendar, he will begin a Nahuatl, Spanish, Latin dictionary, and after the dictionary, outside dogs howl, fearing rain, a nice poetic flourish. He lives to be 90-some, I can't tell you exactly. What is Nahuatl, Spanish, Latin? Nahuatl is the language of the Nahua peoples, the peoples whom we call Aztecs. But the Nahua language group is the Altiplano of Mexico. And Nahuatl is still spoken. It is still, by 1 million speakers, it is still taught. In fact, not still, I should say, it has begun to be taught in schools. If you go to the low part of Mexico, which is the southern part, the Maya part, which includes Guatemala, you hear Maya spoken all the time. So here Sahagún, this great anthropologist and a great preserver of history. So, I think if Galeano thought he could ever be a Sahagún with these 3 volumes, he'd think he'd died and gone to heaven. Obviously, a great model for him and a great, and for everyone, One pilgrimages to where Sahagún worked in Mexico City if you're interested in colonial and indigenous Mexican culture. Now I'm going to do one more on this, if you don't mind, and I'm doing all the talking this time. Did you all see my email on the website that next time I want you to choose a couple, and I'm going to ask you all to expound, and if you don't get to do it on Thursday, then I'll ask you next time. I mean, by the time we've finished these 3 weeks, I hope everyone will have had a chance to put in some 2 cents worth about what you liked and what you didn't. What you're going to find, one of the clusters in this first volume are friars and priests, and they're either bad or they're good. I hate to be so either or. I'm following Octavio Paz. But Galeano has his heroes and he has his villains, and he's very clear about that. And there's one hero here. There's several friars or priests that are held up and still in Mexico today are admired because they came and they colonized in a way that was respectful of other cultures, even as they were proselytizing. And one is Las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas. If you know anything about the state of Chiapas, which is the southern state, here comes our map. Our map's going to come in very handy right now. Let me go to I'll show you right where Chiapas is. And it's worth looking at the map as we do this. Hang on. In North America is where you're going to find modern Mexico, because North America includes Mexico and Central America. Hang on. It's coming up, I hope. There it goes. I'm sorry the colors are a bit light on these maps, but they are. You can use your zoom feature. Let me open this up as big as I can. Okay, so here's Mexico. Here's Houston, Texas. Hey, hi guys. That's the little hand waving at us. I was talking about the Altiplano, where the Nahua groups of languages and peoples, the Nahua, N-A-H-U-A culture. The language is Nahuatl. The culture is Nahua. And there are various versions, lots of them, but this is the Altiplano. Mexico City is 8,000 feet. Puebla, which is right across from the volcanoes over here to the east, is also 8,000 feet. But you go over to Veracruz and you're at sea level. It doesn't take long. This is an extension of the Rockies, really. The Copper Canyon up here is, they'd say, the Grand Canyon of Mexico, and that's exactly right, huge canyon. So Mexico, some of this is desert, but there are mountains here, but then we go to the lowlands, and this is the Maya region here. The Mayas, the Mayas of Guatemala. This is, of course, the Yucatan Peninsula. Mérida is the capital of the Yucatan. Over here's Cancun. We didn't over on this point. But now, what were we looking for? Now I've forgotten. What were we going to look for? Chiapas. Thank you. Chiapas is down here. This is the state of Chiapas, and it might as well be Guatemala. It's Maya. And so, in the state of Chiapas, the capital is called San Cristobal de las Casas. What is the de las Casas? It's the guy we're going to read about on 57 and 58. So the turn to 57, will you? The also like Sagun, a priest, a Dominican, not a Franciscan, a Dominican. The Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Augustinians and the Mercedarians, the fathers of mercy, were the four colonizing orders in the first half of the 16th century in Mexico. Las Casas is, like Sagun, a cultural hero. Let's just read about him, and you're going to find several entries. I want to look at one more of Las Casas, but a kind of cluster, as I started to say, are the heroes and the villains of the colonization of New Spain, and especially New Spain. This guy is Uruguayo. The Galeano is Uruguayan, however you say it. Why is he writing so much at the outside about New Spain? Because New Spain was the first area colonized. Uruguay is the Rio de la Plata. It's south. It comes much later. So, okay, this actually happens to be Santo Domingo. Let's see, Santo Domingo, we all know where that is. It's now the Dominican Republic, right? It shares the island with Haiti because the French got uppity and took half of the Spanish island away. The Haitian half is over here, Port-au-Prince. Okay, so we're seeing. We remember, by the way, remember Havana is super important launching place. Cortés sails from Havana. He starts in 1519. Other conquerors have failed to do it. The guy ahead of him was Grijalvo, I believe. Cortés, he gets some bad reaction from the indigenous peoples on the Yucatan Peninsula, and his genius is to say, no, I think I'll just keep going. And where does he go? He lands at Veracruz. Who names Veracruz the true cross? Cortés. He says, I'm going to plant the Veracruz here, or the Cruz Verdadera it would be, but it's called Veracruz. Takes him 2 years to go over the mountains, walking, riding to get to Tenochtitlan. Anyway, but we've now passed that. We're at 1511. Well, we actually haven't. We're going back, backwards in time, and here we have Las Casas. In the log-walled palm-roof church, Antonio de Montesinos, Dominican friar, hurls thunder from the pulpit. He denounces the extermination. Now here we have a quote. By what right and by what justice do you hold the Indians in such cruel and horrible bondage? Aren't they dying, or better said, aren't you killing them to get gold every day? Are you not obliged to feel to love them as yourselves? Don't you understand this? Don't you feel it? See, even by 1511, before the conquest of Mexico, by 10 years, there are priests saying, no, we can't do this. So another cultural hero, a priest who says, look, it's fine to Christianize these people, but what are we doing? Ben Montesinos, head high, makes his way through the multitude. A murmur of fury swells up. They didn't bargain for this, these peasants from Extremadura and shepherds from Andalusia who have repudiated their names and histories, and with rusty arquebuses, which is crossbows, slung over their shoulders, left at random in search of the mountains of gold and the nude princesses on this side of the ocean. Speaking of the adventurers who get on the ships to come be conquerors. The peasants from Extremadura, a part of Spain. The shepherds from Andalusia, another part of Spain. A mass of pardon and consolation was what was needed by these adventurers, bought with promises of on the steps of Seville Cathedral, these flea-bitten captains, veterans of no battle, and condemned prisoners who had to choose between America and jail or the gallows. We'll denounce you to King Ferdinand, you'll be deported. One bewildered man remained silent. He came to these lands 9 years ago, owner of Indians, gold mines, and plantations. He has made a small fortune. His name is Bartolomé de las Casas, and he will soon be the first priest to be ordained in the New World. He converts to being a Dominican. I mean, he joins the Dominican order. Look, will you, one more real quickly. I think we only have about 3 minutes left. Page 107. You see, and if you look in the index, you'll see there are going to be, I think there are more than these 2 entries about Bartolomé de las Casas, because Las Casas becomes the most famous defender of indigenous rights during the colonial period of anyone. He writes to the king, the atrocities he describes. He said, we can't do this. So as I say, he's a cultural hero. 107, the bottom, called Las Casas. We're now in Campeche, 1544. That's, what, 33 years later, since page 57. We saw him in 1511 in the Dominican Republic. Now we're seeing him in Campeche. Where is Campeche? Look at our map, please. One more time, this map is handy. Campeche is where my hand is, that widowed bitty hand. It's on the east side of the Yucatan Peninsula, Campeche, a walled city. Go visit. It's very beautiful. A walled city, why? Because the Spaniards didn't like the pirates, and the English pirates in particular, coming and robbing their cities. So they put a huge bulwark. The same reason San Juan is walled. The same reason that Cartagena on the Colombian coast is walled. Here's Cartagena. Well, we're not given Cartagena. It's down here from Barranquilla. Beautiful walled city. All of the Spanish Empire was walled against English pirates who were great. The English knew what they were doing in the way of piracy. Okay, bottom of 107, quickly. Uh-oh, we've only got a couple of minutes. What should we do? I'm going to have you read it, but do pay attention to this one, but I don't have time to finish it. Look at page 108. We're going to just do the last 3 paragraphs. This is the most beloved man in America, voice of the voiceless. Again, we see what is admirable for Galeano. Voice of the voiceless, stubborn defender of those who get worse treatment than the dung in the plazas, denouncer of those who, for greed, turn Jesus Christ into the cruelest of gods and the king into a wolf ravening for human flesh. Words of de las Casas. No sooner had he landed in Campeche than Fray Bartolomé de las Casas announced that no owner of Indians would be absolved in confession. Because he's now a priest. He says, I'm not gonna absolve you of your sins if you continue to own Indians as slaves. They answered that here his bishop's credentials were worthless, and so forth. I'm going to let you finish it because we've run out of time on our tape. But the one that follows it right after is about a bad colonizer. So we're going to get these occasional versions of virtue, but rare. Keep on reading, and I hope you enjoy the reading. It's really quite splendid, I think. See you on Thursday.